fellow art historians, and here we are in our last of 3 lectures over 20th century art. And when we last left our story, we were looking at Dadaism, which really became popular at the end of World War I, when people were trying to basically say if the world made sense and war is what makes sense, then they don't really want to make sense. And Dadaism was art that didn't really make sense to everybody else, but it made perfect sense to the artists like Marcel Duchamp, who did the Fountain. So now we are moving into Surrealism, which basically means we're going beyond reality, all right? So during this time, especially after World War I, the ideas of Sigmund Freud and this idea of looking at our subconscious and what was really underneath us, especially as a way of dealing with the stresses of World War I and the trauma that it had caused, Surrealist artists really kind of got tired of looking at the real world. And they had a lot of feelings as well, as you can possibly imagine. So what Surrealism became was, instead of painting the real world, they were deliberately painting a dream world, or things that were beyond reality or couldn't possibly have happened. So like Salvador Dali was known for painting the things that he saw in his dreams. Like he'd wake up from a dream and just start scribbling on a notepad, and start thinking about like what was going on inside of his subconscious, and basically making those unreal things visible to people on canvas. So in terms of Surrealism, the forms that we will see, like in this one, we can see the persistence of memory. We can see clocks that we recognize, and we can see a compass, kind of like a water bottle looking thing, but their meaning is completely lost. We don't exactly know what they mean. So like, with Gauguin or Monk, he was trying to convey an inner idea in a way that made sense. Like we get what they were saying. With these guys, we don't really get what they're saying. They're not really trying to make things make sense, if you will. So like, for example, Jean Miro over here on the left, and another Salvador Dali on the right. Some more Dali paintings. Okay. So the piece that they picked for the 250 for Surrealism, one of them is by Merritt Oppenheim, and it is Luncheon in Fur, which was done in 1936. So this is in between the two wars, and kind of a time where that surrealist subconscious idea was really, really big. So basically it looks like a painting, but it's not. This is actually a teacup and a saucer and a spoon that she took and covered in gazelle fur, right? So this was purposely done because once you do this, it completely ruins the function that these are for, right? So it's no longer realistic. It's beyond reality. You can no longer use these to actually eat with. The whole idea is actually gone. So Luncheon in Fur had multiple interpretations by people, because they were kind of imposing their own ideas on it. So you've basically got two opposing things that she put together here: fur and food. You never want anything furry in your mouth while you're eating. Like, think of getting a hair in your mouth. You're like, ugh, this is good. So you've got two total opposites. Like, what is good for the touch is bad to the taste. All right. So these two things don't really go together. And that's what Surrealism is. It's kind of beyond reality. And this is called a sculpture, and it's a type of sculpture called assemblage, where you kind of assemble things, you put them together. So you're creating a sculpture out of 3-dimensional objects and kind of assemble them together. And this actually came from a conversation she was having with Picasso, and she had on these bracelets on her wrist, and he mentioned that anything looks good in fur, and the fur bracelets that she had on, and she was kind of like, well, okay, I can challenge that. So they were in a cafe when this conversation happened. So she took a cup and a saucer and a spoon, and she covered them with fur. And there's a lot of things that people read into this in terms of its interpretation. There were a lot of people who, during Freudian days, found a great deal of sexuality in this. They were like, it represents, something else. So basically feminine objects like teacups with masculinity of sculpture. So basically combining masculine and feminine, masculine and female. So it kind of became a, people interpreted as a sexual thing. Not really. But one cool thing about her in doing this is so what makes it surrealism in this sculpture is it's obviously beyond reality, because once you cover these in fur, the actual realistic use of them is gone. And she actually was one of those artists that left for Switzerland to get away from the Nazis because she was considered unworthy. She was a degenerate. Because of what she was doing with her art, and she really kind of cracked open the glass ceiling for artists like that were surrealists to kind of take those risks at the time. Okay, so then we're going to move into surrealism is an idea that's really going to spread out. Like, it's European artists, people from everywhere were exposed to this idea of surrealism, and it kind of takes hold everywhere to the point of where people start looking for it where the artist would say it isn't. They're like, I'm not actually a surrealist, but people would say, well, that's beyond reality what you're painting, so therefore it must be surrealism. So that brings us to Frida Kahlo, right, who is a Mexican painter. And I really feel awful for this woman and everything that she went through. She deliberately tried to convey this idea that she didn't believe in conventional ideas of beauty. She usually shows facial hair on herself, like her eyebrows are famous for like basically growing together. She had a lot of facial hair on her face. Like, she kind of went against all normal traditions, but that's because she didn't consider herself traditional herself. She was of mixed heritage. Her mother was Mexican and her father was German, and she struggled with that her entire life. Like, she was, am I European or am I Mexican? She married Diego Rivera, who we're going to talk about, who was Mexican and was extremely proud of his Mexican heritage, even though he was awful to her. He encouraged her to really embrace that native Mexican style. She was very familiar with the medical field. She had polio. She had an injured foot. She was hit by a bus. She had repeated miscarriages that may have been the result of getting hit by the bus. So her works of art tend to have a lot of medical references in them because she's very familiar with the tools and things that you would have seen. And she was married to this man who's a famous artist in his own right named Diego Rivera. And Rivera was just awful to her, just cheated on her all the time. She couldn't have his children. He messed with her head. I mean, their marriage was a constant source of turmoil to her. But her artwork is very self-expressive, like kind of like Rembrandt. She does more self-portraits than she does anything else. And her self-portraits were more a reflection of her reality. Like, that's what she would say, is I'm painting my reality as I see it. But people would say, well, it's surrealist. And she's like, no, it's actually very real to me. And this also kind of goes with that popularity of photography at the time. Like, photography could capture the real world. So artists were much more encouraged to kind of paint their inner feelings or their inner thoughts or their inner interpretations at the time. So these are two paintings by Frida Kahlo that people would be like, well, that's very surrealist. And she's like, nope, that's very real to me. Like, I'm a deer living in a masculine world. So she's female with horns on her head. She actually may have been confused or had different identities in terms of her sexuality. So that may have played a role in that. She often struggled with challenges facing that. And here she is wounded by criticism, by love, by whatever. This one on the left, it definitely puts two different things together. It puts together her European heritage and it puts together her Mexican heritage and how she's kind of, straddling between those two lines. And people said it's surreal, it's not possible, but she didn't. This was her reality to her. So the piece for the 250 that they picked is the Two Fridas. And this piece was inspired by her divorce from Diego Rivera. And there are a lot of people who were like, this is definitely surrealist, but to her, this was very, very real in terms of what she was dealing with. And it's the largest canvas that she ever painted. And you can see that in the background, she uses those colors and those lines to kind of create a stormy background. And then in the foreground, like coming out towards us, we have these two mirror images of Frida. And one is she's dressed in European style dress, and on the other side, she's dressed in her Mexican style dress. And you have two hearts on the outside, and those two hearts are connected by a vein, like one vein that unites them together. And you can see that she's holding, on the Mexican side, she's holding a portrait of Diego Rivera in her hand. All right. And while they are joined together, these two parts of her that make up her identity, she has cut that bloodline off to her husband. Like, she's got a clamp here that is clamping the artery off. She's no longer going to be bleeding out from this. Like, she was basically killing her. Like, she's bleeding to death from this marriage. Now, in her mind, this is very autobiographical. Like, this is not a dream to her. This is exactly what she's going through. And you can see that her European heart is kind of cut open, and her native heart is more whole, right? And there's kind of things that maybe she has embraced more of her native side to that. But also, if you think about it, when we talked about the Aztecs, because she's Mexican, the Aztecs are the Mexica, and they have that heritage. And part of that was removing the heart as part of the human sacrifice. So maybe that is part of this, like she has sacrificed her heart as part of this, like it has come out of her, and like this is what she has become. So you have all of this symbolism in this self-portrait that she is, you know, kind of showing the two sides to herself, and they're clamped very closely together, like they're very closely tied together, these two parts of her, and she's kind of severed herself off from this marriage that was, you know, basically causing her to bleed alive. And she would know what that type of, you know, medical instrument looked like because of all the medical experiences she'd had in her life. Then we have her husband, all right, Diego Rivera, which I'm like, oh my God, every time I see him, I'm like, he really is not a good looking guy. And Diego Rivera was a very passionate man. I mean, he had a lot of feelings about a lot of things. He was a communist supporter in, you know, Mexico that was extremely poor at the time. He was best known for his murals. And one of the reasons why he liked to paint murals, which are done on walls, is because they were public. He wanted to show that art was not just for the elite in Mexico. It was for everybody to celebrate the heritage, you know, of the people who were Mexican, who had, you know, been ruled basically by these elite dictators or the Spanish for however long. He actually did murals in Detroit for Henry Ford's factory. So he was very well known for how well he could do a mural that showed many different things at one time and almost kind of told a story. But he was very proud of his Mexican heritage and that part of him that was true Mexican. And he had a big spot in his heart for the people in Mexico who had suffered under the upper class or the elite for so long. And his reviving of these murals was kind of a way to show that I want these to be public. I want art to be for the people, not just something elite that only the upper class can see. So the work of art for the 250 that they've picked is Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park, which he would say is surrealist. Like, he definitely gets that, all right? That it is, this is not possible. It's something that maybe he dreamed together. And it also is surrealist because it spans 3 different time periods in Mexican history that never could have, these people on the different sections could never ever have been together at the same time. So like, for example, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is actually included in this. She was not around at the same time that Diego Rivera was, all right? So he put all of these people in this, and Alameda Park was in Mexico, and he wanted this to kind of represent this area that would have been available to all of Mexico so that everybody could have seen it. So this work of art is definitely considered to be surrealist, but it's also symbolic in what he includes in this. And it's really, really, really weird in terms of what he puts into it. Okay, so these people in this, in the 3 section that it's divided into, would never have all been together at the same time. And it's almost a narrative telling a story of Mexico and the struggles that they went through, right? So this was originally placed in a hotel, but after they had an earthquake, they placed it in the actual park, which was the first city park of Mexico. which was actually built over an Aztec marketplace. So it's basically saying that the present has stomped on the past, and we need to remember the past because, you know, this city park of Mexico is actually over something that is of Aztec heritage. There are 400 historical figures that are put into this different painting that's divided up into 3 sections, right? And each section tells a story of Mexican history. So we're going to step through that. And it also kind of talks about where Diego Rivera feels that he fits into this Mexican history, if you will. So over on the far left, which is the first panel of this, all right, this is, you can see, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is actually up here. I don't know if you can see her. She's kind of in the left, next to the naked guy right here, kind of by his backside, if you will. But you have here, this is when the natives were actually, hang on, might be the wrong one. No, that's it. Okay, so this is when the natives were conquered by the Spanish. So all the way over here on the far left, you can see the guy in the Spanish collar, like Philip II of Spain. This is when the natives were kind of thrown into the crematoriums and killed. Is when they were conquered and basically enslaved by the Spanish, right? And then you can see the Spanish influence starting to come into Mexico during this time. And he uses these balloons right here to separate the panel. So the forms of the balloons separate that first part of Mexican history into the next part. So this is the central panel. And this one is actually something he would have seen in his own life. So these were experiences that he had. And it also talks about his relationship with Frida Kahlo at the time, because Frida, while he was painting this, was actually injured and she was very, very ill, and he was caring for her. And there's belief that he did this and made himself, if you look right here in front, he's a small child standing behind Frida. And Frida herself is a lot larger because maybe she was smothering him. Like he was, you know, basically being reduced to a child, and as he was, you know, trying to take care of her at the same time. So this entire central panel, if you see that there's people who are dressed in these very wealthy clothes, are kind of like the elite of Mexican society. These are the people who had some white heritage to them, who had rich land-owning families, who were very, very wealthy, and kind of abusing the lower classes, like basically living off the backs of the lower people. Right in the center of it, you can see La Katrina, which is kind of this symbol to him of what lies underneath these wealthy women. It's basically, you know, they're just, you know, evil kind of beings, if you will. Like they're basically just skeletons who are feeding off of everyone else. And he was inspired by another artist named Posada, who used La Katrina. So he put this in here also to honor Posada, who taught him how to do murals. So he puts himself, like La Katrina actually became like this pop culture symbol of Mexico, which everybody kind of thought was like this cool symbol, but he was kind of like, no, it just represents the ugliness underneath of the upper class. But it was popular, and he puts himself right next to La Katrina because he considers himself pop culture as too, like he's just as popular as she is. But it also gives tribute to that Aztec heritage, because the Aztec skulls and the Aztec bodies and kind of like this idea of an earth mother. So there's all kinds of symbolism to why he included La Katrina, but you can see she's wearing furs, and there's a snake around her, which is kind of an Aztec heritage thing. And then at the same time, she's got on this popular dress at the time. And then if you look, there's an elitist police officer back over here who's ordering the family out of the park. And this woman in the yellow is like, you can't tell us to leave. And he's kind of saying, no, this is for the upper class, when it's actually built over an Aztec marketplace. So that skeleton skull may be a reference to that this was actually Aztec before, which is at the center of their culture, because she's right in the center of the painting. Now, if you look over here to the right, you'll see Porfirio Diaz, who was a dictator of Mexico, who was very, very terrible. He was kind of like he's looking over all of this. Like he was kind of the the leader who made life absolutely miserable for the people of Mexico at the time, unless you were on the elite side. So you've got here the police who are kicking the families out of the park. You've got the little girls and the dogs. You see the upper class whites with their backs kind of turned to the native Mexicans. And then over here on the far right, you can see that he uses this tree to divide it into this scene, and the policeman is almost pushing him to this, because then you see that same yellow hat appear at the top with these revolutionary leaders who are like Pancho Villa, who are leading the revolution to overthrow Porfirio Diaz and return Mexico to the people of Mexico and tried to give land to everybody. So basically you see this cop, again, who's pushing the people out of the park, and he's basically pushed them towards this revolution. So this by Diego Rivera is very symbolic, but it's also very surreal because these people could never have all been together at the same time. So surrealism, like I said, influenced people everywhere. If you went to Europe, it was kind of like the hot new thing because people were so over realism. Like after World War I, they just had so much real. They're like, I'm so done with reality. So the idea of looking at stuff that had to do with non-reality or people's heads, what was going on in their minds, that was very powerful, all right? And Wilfredo Lamb is actually an artist from Cuba. And it's important for you guys to understand in context that during this time, Cuba looks great. I mean, people, you've heard of like Havana, and to the Americans, like Cuba was this party place, like it was a paradise, but underneath it was not. I mean, it was basically Cuba had been the place of sugar plantations. There was a great deal of poverty there. If you weren't one of the elites, you were really, really treated poorly. And it was mostly people who were native to Africa who had been brought over as slaves, which of course his heritage was as well, Wilfredo Lamb. So Wilfredo Lamb had gone over to Europe and he'd been very inspired by the Surrealists, but he also was extremely inspired by Cubists at the same time. He loved that idea of using the canvas to show all sides of something, because it's not just about physically showing all sides of the subject, it's about showing all sides of the issue, that there's more to it than what you actually see, which I think is just so cool. It's basically these guys took Cubism and took it to a much higher level of not just showing a physical object from all sides, like he did with the Demoiselle d'Avignon or Brock did with the Portuguese. It's let me show you all the sides, the actual truths to this by showing you the entire thing, all right? So Wilfredo Lamb, okay, he's African of descent. He's from Cuba. He goes to Europe. He's so inspired that he creates the jungle. And just to give you guys an idea, this is an African jungle, all right? You see African-style masks with the geometric features that were in it, and Cubism allowed him to show so many different sides of this. Like you can almost see the front, back, and sides of everything. And in the back, though, what you're actually looking at, those lengths, those lines are actually sugarcane, which does not grow in Africa. It grows in Cuba. So this is basically paying tribute to the fact that, hey, all of you guys who think that Cuba is this beautiful paradise for you to come party in, let me show you all sides of it. Let me show you the truth of it, that it is actually a paradise because it's built on sugarcane that Africans came over here as slaves to build, and those people are incredibly poor. So to reference that heritage, he's got the African masks in it, and then he's got all of these different, like there's different masks hidden within it, all right? There's 4 female figurines and 1/2 of a horse. Like the horse almost seems to grow out of a leg, which is that very surrealist. And there's people who say that that's partially voodoo, which was when you take basically African religions and you mix them with Christianity, what you got kind of was like this Vodun religion. And so it's a mixed, so kind of like the people were mixed, like it was African mixed into Cuba for this purposes of growing sugarcane. So what he kind of inspired this to be, he said, I wanted to paint the drama of my country but by thoroughly expressing the Black spirit, right? So he's like, you had these people from Africa who had their own cultures, who had their own art. You can clearly see the nudity in it. You can see the shears that are in it up at the top to cut the sugar cane. And then they're brought over here, these beautiful people, and they're basically turned into slaves to grow sugar for you. And you think it's so beautiful here, but this is what it's actually about. He said, I knew I was running the risk of not being understood because it is cubist and it is surrealist, and it definitely fragments and breaks this apart, and very surrealist because so many of these things couldn't happen. But he considered this a Trojan horse, where the Trojan horse had the truth hidden within it. And so that may be what the horse is. He's like, this is, at first glance, it looks pretty. The colors are pretty, it looks fun, and it looks vibrant, kind of like Cuba does. But underneath, it's actually really, really ugly. And through Cubism, I'm showing you all the sides of it, which I think is really powerful. Now, some places in the world, however, right, so this is kind of that exception to the rule, while European artists were experimenting with moving away from showing things realistically, like either they're painting non-representational things that look like nothing, right? Or they're painting things in unrealistic ways, like Cubism or like what Diego Rivera was doing. There were some places in the world where they needed the images to still be crystal clear for their viewers. They needed art that spoke to the masses, that was extremely clear to whoever was looking at it, because they didn't want an educated audience that needed to think about something. They wanted the image to be very, very clear. So during World War I, Russia had a revolution where they turned communist. And communism doesn't really work unless it happens at the end of a barrel of a gun. Like, you basically have to force it down people's throats. And there was a lot of propaganda used by communists as a way to show that what they were doing was working. But you want people working, not really thinking as much. So you want to make the image very, very clear. So what we see in Russia is something called constructivism, right? Where they're going to start using mediums of photography to construct a meaning with it, right? It was functional, not meant to be looked at or gone like, I want to think about that. Nope, it's meant to be looked at and understood. All right, so this right here was actually built between World War I and World War II in the Soviet Union, which used to be Russia, and it's propaganda that was put out by the Communist Party. And this is actually a photo montage, which means it is a collage made up of lots and lots and lots of different photos combined together in different tones and different scenes to convey a message. It's almost like it was constructed or built out of photographs. And this is called The Results of the First 5-Year Plan by Vervara Stepanova, which that may stand out to you. This is a woman, but communist countries were all about equality and everybody needed to contribute their share. And that included women. Like, communist countries actually included more opportunities for women than other places in the world did at the time, because it was everybody needs to contribute. Doesn't really matter what gender you are. So when Joseph Stalin took over the Soviet Union, he started what was called the 5-year plans, which basically said you're going to meet these goals in 5 years or there will be consequences. And they were mostly achieved by force. And were very, very violent. So like food quotas or production quotas with the goal of catching Russia up very, very quickly. And they were awful, but they worked. That's the really bad part. Like, he did catch Russia up because they felt like they needed to be, because they got destroyed so badly in World War I. So basically what happened is, you know, everybody was forced into working in factories. Some people were moved onto farms. There was no private industry, no private business. You basically got told what you were going to make, when you were going to make it. They decided what you could have and what you couldn't. And then here we go. Like, we're going to catch Russia up this way, basically forcing people to work. But it was working. So they wanted to use propaganda to really convince people that this was the way to do things. So just like this could unite Russia as a whole, these pictures were united together as a whole to give this image that the 5-year plans were working. So what you have over here is a picture of Vladimir Lenin, who was the founder of communism in the Soviet Union. And he is there with these electrical lines, which had been built because of the 5-year plan. And they, if you follow the lines down, are powering loudspeakers to get out the message of the CCP down here below it, which is the Chinese Communist Party. And then you see people at the bottom who are celebrating and all of these things that are just so great and how well this is working and what it's providing for the people. And it was used entirely as propaganda, and red is the color of communism, so that's what that was used for. Now, 1939, we see this, kind of propaganda. 1932, and then 1939, World War II starts. And when that happens, Europe kind of goes to hell. Right, the art movement that is going on there, a lot of the artists had to leave. They had to run and get away because the Nazis were going to try to kill them otherwise. Plus, there was just so much fighting going on. So a lot of European artists left and came to America. And then in the aftermath, America kind of became, for the first time, the true artistic center of the world. Meanwhile, Hitler was trying to collect works of art for his Führer Museum that he considered to be pure art. He loved art that was classical. He loved, basically the older style of art, and he considered newer styles of art degenerate. And a lot of those artists were killed or committed suicide or had to leave. And this is after the war, when they were uncovering where a lot of people were hiding these works of art to protect. Sorry, I had to pause that. My daughter came in crying. But this is where, like I was mentioning, museums would hide famous works of art so that the Nazis couldn't get them. They hid them all over Europe, trying to get them away from them. And this is the recovering of works of art that the Nazis had taken, such as the Burghers of Calais, which Hitler really wanted. So America during the wars was obviously having its own problems. We were in the middle of a Great Depression. The Civil War had ended, but that had left behind a legacy of segregation and racism that was going on in our country. There was a great separation that was happening over here between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, the people who were white, the people who were black. And art was used here to kind of address those issues in something called social realism, which was kind of using art as a way to bring attention to what was going on and, creating these divides in our country. And during this time, we experienced what was called the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so you know what Renaissance means. It means a rebirth. And what happened during this time was there was a huge migration. This is a big context event. A migration of African Americans from the southern part of the country, where they were still treated pretty badly after the history of the Civil War. We know some of the worst abuses took place in Alabama and Mississippi. And these African Americans moved to northern cities like New York, where they could find jobs, because there were a lot of available jobs in the northern part of the country, way more than in the South, which was largely agricultural. And these African Americans would live in certain areas together, kind of like unity in areas like Harlem. And they started really using the arts, like writing and music, to kind of celebrates the contribution and the experience of the African American in United States history. And an African artist named Jacob Lawrence created a series of 60 paintings. So we're talking 60 paintings that aren't very big, that all go together to kind of talk about movement. The entire theme of this is movement, and it's the movement of African Americans through society and also physically to the north. So it's kind of a metaphor for their movement in society and the way that they've come, but it's also the physical migration of them from the south. And it's done in tempera paint, which I think is pretty interesting, because he does it as a way to throw back to the Renaissance type of painting, because instead of using like oil paints, he goes back to an older style of paint. So this is, when he creates this series of paintings, he uses very simplified colors to unify them together. So reds and yellows and blues, because he's much more focused on the forms and the lines to create movement. So you notice that like the girl's hands all kind of show a movement to the right through the painting, like upwards and progressing. So showing like this, upward through the numbers, upward in progression, like moving up in society through education. Like that was a pathway. The piece for the 250 they've picked over here is this particular panel from The Migration of the Negro. And it is incredibly powerful what he does with this. So you'll notice that he creates movement from the top of the bottom, like he moves your eye through it by basically getting rid of linear perspective. He doesn't do this. He almost does it from a bird's eye view looking down. And you can see that as the barrier, the gold barrier in the middle goes back and forth, your eye bounces to the people on each side. And you can see that the people who are African American don't have facial features because they are more seen as a group than they are individuals, where the white people are more seen individually. And we've got these two people who are trying as much as possible to separate themselves. So almost like the segregation by looking away, looking kind of smug with their back to it, like I don't want to see it. And then down here at the bottom, like he's just got these huge hands clenching this paper. Like, I'm not going to look at them. I'm not going to acknowledge it. Like, I don't want to see this. I'm angry that I even have to share space here. And then what he does just with like these geometric shapes and these forms is by making this person smaller up here, he looks farther away. Like he looks even more isolated. And then this person at the bottom, like we can see that she kind of like her head is lower than her shoulders are. So you can kind of see this is an older person and it's a woman because of the hat that she's wearing. And you can kind of see that this is across all of them. It was all ages, all races as a group because they're all unified in not having facial features. They were all treated very badly, but there's movement in each one of the panels because this was all about movement and the migration of these people. So you can see here they are moving like to Chicago, New York, and St. Louis, and the lines through it move towards those different gates to leave. And we can see the movement of the irons and the fact that a lot of these women worked in domestic work and how hard that work is because they're kind of slumped over with their shoulders. And he does this with minimal shape through it. It's really just incredible. So here's a couple other examples here you can see. All right, so America is actually going to be one of the bravest places in the world in terms of art because we could. We were away from the war. We were fighting in it, sure, but we were away from it. And we weren't living in a place where dictators were telling us what was acceptable or was not. And after World War II was over and we had the ability to start focusing on art again, our country wasn't physically destroyed outside of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. We were still doing just fine. So we kind of just started, picking back up where we left off. We started creating this huge consumer culture. All our machinery started producing consumer goods, and our artists started getting even braver. And we see the development of abstract expressionism. And what that is it's the first truly, completely abstract art movement where it has nothing to do with anything representational. It doesn't look like anything. It's more about the process of how it's made is art, right? And it's non-objective. It looks like no object. It's just the way it was painted as the art. So for example, Jackson Pollock, who was a action painter, who would spray paint and like spit it and throw it. And it was how he made it that was the process. And this quote over here, it says, "It was impossible to paint the kind of paintings we were doing. It's over. Like we need to do something new." So Jackson Pollock had this style of action painting, of kind of throwing this painting or the paint all over the canvas and just kind of walking around and splattering it. Okay, now listen very carefully to what I'm about to explain, right? Abstract expressionism like this up here by Jackson Pollock is you've hit the wall, right? You're no longer painting anything that looks like an object. You're just painting in a particular way. The only way to go from there without copying that is to use that style to paint objects. Like you have to go back the opposite direction. Like, okay, otherwise everybody would just look like Jackson Pollock. So you got to go back the opposite direction to actually painting objects. And the artist that they picked for that is Willem De Kooning. And Willem De Kooning was highly influenced by Jackson Pollock. He loved the way that Jackson Pollock painted, where it was fast and aggressive and really quick, and it just kind of happened. Like art was a happening. It was an event. It wasn't something you went in with the end result in mind. It just kind of happened. And Willem De Kooning picked that up in his Woman series. All right, so he creates a series of paintings about the female figure, and there's huge debates on whether Willem De Kooning actually liked women or not. Like, we can't 100% figure that out. Some people said that he really didn't like them. He had a bad relationship with his mother. He had a bad relationship with his wife, his girlfriend, whatever. But then there's people who say he actually was commenting on the exploitation of women at the time, because women in this new commercial age were basically being used as advertising objects, and they were used to accentuate certain parts of their bodies, like their breasts, their face, their teeth. They were only focusing on certain aspects. So basically women had gone from being these Venuses in, prehistoric times to the like the Mary figure, like the Madonna of this beautiful woman of motherhood, to now they were turning into just objects again. So basically women had kind of blurred into the background, and he was trying to, I guess, show that they were re-emerging, because women had been in the background for a long time, but now they're re-emerging. They're just re-emerging as objects to sell things. All right. And where this actually came from is, if you ever see the paintings by Willem De Kooning, he uses newspaper cutouts of teeth, because he used newspaper to hold onto the paint, because he would put so much paint on the canvas it would start dripping off, like it would become oversaturated. So he would put newspaper on it, and at one point he found this newspaper clipping of like this really grotesque like smile, and he put that on there and then just painted around it. So you can always see like the teeth always look a little bit grotesque. So this is his Woman series right here. And you can see that when we talk about the foreground is what is coming towards us or closest to us, and then the background and the way that he paints is abstract, but he's starting to bring the figure back, like an object, a woman, out of that background. Like she's starting to emerge again. So it's kind of like we've hit the wall with Jackson Pollock, and now we're going back the opposite direction, where the figure is starting to re-emerge, and it's a woman who's appearing out of these lines that he uses. So when he paints, it's an event, right? It's an encounter between him and the materials. He's not really focused on the end product. He doesn't really care. It's just a finished product. What happened, happened. And that's how he paints it. So Woman 1, right, you'll notice that he kind of references those Venus figurines we looked at the beginning of the year, which were kind of fertility with their enhanced reproductive figures. And then women kind of went into the background for all of history. Like they were basically the Madonna figure. It was of motherhood, and basically women took a back seat. Well, now women are being put front and center, but they're being used as objects of advertisement, which is why he used those smiles from like advertisements, and their bodies are being exploited to basically sell things. Like they're not really being celebrated for them. They're being used to sell objects. So they've gone from traditional ideas of beauty, like they used to be beauty because they had these features. Now they're beautiful because we can sell using those features. And he really liked Cubism too, because he liked to be able to show multiple sides of it. Like it's almost coming off the canvas, out of that splatter paint, slashing, aggressive male background, to you see this feminine emerging. So from here, again, you can only go so far with just the way that you paint being art. Like otherwise, like I said, we'd all look like Jackson Pollock trying to paint, because it's not anything. It doesn't look like anything. So with Willem De Kooning, and now this artist, Helen Frankenthaler, we start going back the opposite direction, but it's still that idea of it's the way I painted the object, not the object itself. So for Willem De Kooning, it's not how I painted, or it's not the woman that I painted, it's how I painted the woman. Same thing with Helen Frankenthaler, all right? She actually is a much calmer version, where Willem De Kooning slashes and lays on these thick layers of paints, and it's very aggressive and masculine. Helen Frankenthaler did something completely different. She took paint, acrylic paint, because it's thicker, so it moves slower. It doesn't like run as fast. And she would pour it onto the canvas, and then she would take the canvas and she'd kind of move it like this to get the paint to move. She didn't use a brush at all. She just let it kind of creep and move and manipulated it by the way that she moved the canvas. And by the title of it, she helped kind of define what the object was. But it really was the focus more on how she was painting it with these acrylic paints. So she would get the canvas wet, which holds paint a little bit better instead of it just running off. And then she would pour the paint on and then move the canvas around. And she's not creating a nature object, she's creating a feeling of nature. So like we have the ground, and then we have these cooling, blues, right? And she just is concerned about whether she painted a beautiful picture, not if it looks like something in particular. And this technique was called soak staining. And it's this idea that color is the subject, not the bay. It's the color is the subject that she turned into a bay. She didn't start with, I'm going to paint a bay. She started with, here's some color. It's a bay. There it is. This is the canyon. And I guess the negative space here in the middle is the canyon, and the green represents the sides. I don't know. No clue. So this was part of a movement called color field painting, which this is what they were selling. Like this is what art was, where it basically was color was the subject, and these sold for millions of dollars, and my daughter could do it, but that's not the point. Okay, so we're entering into the 1960s now, and America is in the post-World War boom. We're doing amazing, and people are now spending more time in front of the television than they are in museums. So we get an artist named Andy Warhol, and Andy Warhol is like, well, if pop culture is what people want, then I'm going to use it for art, because it's a commentary at the same time on the fact that this is what we have come to, that the television and what we advertise, like, this is art to you. Like, television is art. So if that's the case, fine. I can make art out of pop culture. I can take the object that you recognize and I can mass produce it and turn it into art, right? And it really was this rebellion against the abstract expressionists, who were just, the way that they were painting was art. He's like, no, I'm going to use objects because I think people are getting dumber watching TV and watching these celebrities and watching all these advertisements and stuff. So if that's what they want as art, then I'm going to turn that into art. So for example, Coke bottles, and Chairman Mao of China with his red lips, because communism came from his lips, because people would be watching the news on China during this time. So the artwork that they've picked for the 250 is the Maryland Diptych, all right? And a diptych is an item used in religious worship, where you would open it to two sides and it would have an image on it. So it's kind of an image, or it's an object of personal devotion or prayer. So basically, he's taken Marilyn Monroe, who everybody knew on TV at the time. This was her heyday. This is when she would have been having her affair with John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and everybody knew her and everybody wanted to look like her. And he was a huge fan of her, but he was devastated by the fact that society had basically turned her into an object. And that's what Hollywood had done, was turn her into an object. Marilyn Monroe wasn't even her actual name. It was Norma Jean. She had her nose done. They changed her hair. She doesn't look anything like she did early on. And they turned her into a mass-produced object for the consumers. That's what she was. And she was an object of worship. Like, people absolutely worshipped her. So you'll notice that over here on the left, he's got this gold background, which is kind of like a Byzantine icon, like that gold heavenly background. Like, she's an object of worship. And he uses her over and over and over and over again, a mass-produced object that over time, the more you produce it, starts to fade. And you can see that not only did she start to fade, she started to lose herself and who she actually was. So he starts to use the object that was recognizable to make a comment, because he needed the object. He needed representational art to kind of get that point across. And you'll notice that she starts out a little bit faded, and over time, her hair, her eyes, and her lips get darker because that's what the movie theaters and the movie producers accentuated. Her hair, her eyes, and her lips. That was her commodities. But then over time, with just mass producing, she starts to fade, she starts to get blurred out, and we forget about who she was before, and we just see her as an object. We didn't see her as a person. She actually was very, very intelligent and wanted to learn about everything and suffered from a great deal of mental illness. She'd been sexually abused in foster homes. Her mother had mental illness, and all of that was forgotten. It was just, she was just an object to be there to entertain. That was her job. That was her use as an object. And Andy Warhol used her recognizable image the same way he used Campbell's soup cans and Coke bottles and images of people to kind of comment on, this is what we do. We're focusing now on the objects. And I think he would have really liked Willem De Kooning's work in terms of what was happening to women at the time. So I used this. So the image is for a still movie named from a still, so kind of like a shot from a movie called Niagara, which, if I remember right, Marilyn Monroe didn't want to do because it was just another movie turning her into a blonde bimbo. Like that she just didn't want to be that person anymore, but that's what her contract was. That's who she was. So I use this because that's actually my brother, and that's his arm. And he has Marilyn Monroe tattooed on his arm with a Hollywood symbol underneath her. And he had all these pinup posters of her in his room, and actually underneath his arm right here is another image of her. And I'm just like, you just put her on, do you know who she was? Do you know what she was about? Or are you just honoring her as a sex symbol? And he just thought she was beautiful, so that's what he put on there. So just a real life example of what Andy Warhol was talking about and why he felt that Marilyn Monroe was a good example of how we had been so obsessed now with consumer culture that even people were becoming objects. So we are now done with 20th century art, and we'll be moving on to finish with 20th century sculpture.